Why am I here, and what am I doing here, and which place
She
is
woke
this?
up pregnant. She can't remember his touch, but she's carrying his heiress. I don't know who I am, but I know this child is in danger. A woman's whisper, trembling. Cut to a hospital monitor beeping. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark hair styled with casual perfection and eyes so intensely blue they seemed to see straight through her. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her yearly salary, tailored to perfection across broad shoulders and a lean frame. Everything about him screamed power, wealth, and control. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass, and there was something predatory in the way he moved, like a wolf approaching prey. "You're awake," he said, his voice deep and rich, with an edge of something Faith couldn't quite identify. Relief, anger, possession. "Who are you?" Faith managed to choke out, backing away until she hit the wall. "Where am I? What's happening?" The man's expression shifted, something dark flickering across his features. He took a step closer, and Faith could smell his cologne, expensive, masculine, intoxicating. "You don't remember," he said, and it wasn't a question. His jaw tightened. Dr. Morrison warned this might happen. "Remember what? Who's Dr. Morrison? Please, I don't understand any of this." Faith's voice rose with her panic, her hands instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. "The last thing I remember is, I was at the school. It was March. I was planning the spring festival with my students. Now I'm. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the impossible reality. "It's October," the man said quietly, moving closer despite her obvious fear. "You've been with me for 7 months, Faith. My name is George William, and that child you're carrying, our daughter, she's the heiress to the William Empire." Faith felt the world tilt beneath her feet. George William. The name everyone knew. The billionaire CEO whose face graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune, whose business dealings made headlines, whose personal life was the subject of endless speculation and gossip. George William, who at 34 had built an empire that spanned technology, real estate, and finance. George William, who was notoriously private, ruthlessly ambitious, and devastatingly handsome. And according to him, she'd been living with him, pregnant with his child. For 7 months, she couldn't remember. "No," Faith breathed, shaking her head. "That's impossible. I would never. I don't even know you. I teach 3rd grade in Millbrook, Connecticut. I live in a studio apartment. I have a cat named Whiskers. This has to be a mistake." George's expression hardened. "There's no mistake. You've been here, in this penthouse, under my protection and care. You are carrying my daughter, and in 3 months, you will give birth to the heir of everything I've built." "Stop saying that." Faith's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "This is insane. You're insane. I don't remember any of this. How can you expect me to just accept?" "Because it's the truth." George closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders, not roughly, but firmly enough that she couldn't pull away. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the intensity in those impossibly blue eyes. "Faith, look at me. I know you're scared. I know this seems impossible. But you need to calm down for the baby's sake." "The baby." His words cut through her panic like a knife. Faith's hands moved to her stomach again, feeling the firm swell beneath her palms. There was a life inside her, innocent and dependent on her, regardless of how impossible this all seemed. She took a shuddering breath, then another, trying to steady herself. "I need answers," she said, her voice trembling but stronger now. "I need to know everything. How did this happen? Why can't I remember? And why?" She looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of deception. "Why would someone like you want someone like me?" Something flickered in George's eyes, pain, perhaps, or regret. He released her shoulders and stepped back, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it for the first time since he'd entered the room. "That's a longer story than you might think. But you deserve answers. Sit down, Faith. This is going to take a while. Faith allowed herself to be guided to an overstuffed chair by the window, her legs still shaky. George sat across from her, and for a moment, they just looked at each other, two strangers bound together by circumstances Faith couldn't begin to understand. 7 months ago, George began, his voice measured and careful, you walked into my life and changed everything. But to understand how, I need to start earlier than that. I need to tell you about a promise I made, a debt I owe, and a future I'm trying to secure. 7 months earlier, George William had never believed in fate. He believed in strategy, in calculated risks, in turning every situation to his advantage. That's how he'd built William Industries from a small tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire before he turned 30. That's how he'd outmaneuvered competitors, bought out rivals, and established himself as one of the most powerful men in the world. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The night he met Faith Jeffrey, George had been running on 2 hours of sleep and his fourth espresso of the day. His assistant had finally convinced him to attend a charity gala, something about optics and public relations that George normally would have delegated. But this particular event was funding educational programs in underserved communities, and despite his ruthless reputation, George had a soft spot for education. His own mother had been a teacher before she died, and her memory was one of the few things that could pierce his carefully constructed armor. Faith hadn't belonged at that gala any more than a wildflower belongs in a hothouse. She'd won a ticket through a raffle at her school, a prize she'd almost refused because she owned nothing appropriate to wear to such an event. But her best friend had insisted, lending her a simple blue dress that happened to match her eyes and make her honey blonde hair shine like spun gold. George had noticed her immediately. Not because she was the most glamorous woman in the room. She wasn't, but because she was real. While everyone else worked the crowd with practiced smiles and strategic conversations, Faith stood alone by a window, staring out at the city lights with an expression of pure wonder. She held her champagne glass like she wasn't quite sure what to do with it, and when someone bumped into her, she apologized even though it hadn't been her fault. Against his better judgment, George had approached her. Not a fan of crowds, he'd asked, and she'd turned to him with startled eyes that held no recognition. She didn't know who he was. In a room full of people trying to get his attention, trying to make connections, trying to use him for their advantage, she had no idea she was talking to George William. Is it that obvious? She'd laughed, a sound like wind chimes that made something in his chest tighten. I'm completely out of my element. I teach 8-year-olds. The fanciest event I usually attend is the school talent show. They'd talked for hours. About education and dreams, about the gap between what children needed and what society provided, about books and music and the small joys that made life worth living. Faith told him about her students with such passion and love that George found himself actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. She told him about growing up in a small town, about her parents who'd passed away when she was young, about building a life from almost nothing and finding purpose in helping children do the same. And George, who never revealed anything personal, found himself sharing things he'd told no one. About his mother, who'd died of cancer when he was 10. About his father, who'd remarried within a year to a woman who saw George as nothing more than an obstacle to her own children's inheritance. About building his empire not just for wealth but as proof that he mattered, that he was more than the unwanted stepson who'd been pushed aside. When Faith finally asked what he did, George had hesitated. He'd been enjoying being just a man talking to a woman, not a billionaire being courted for his money and power. But he'd told her the truth, and he'd watched her eyes widen with shock. You're George William? The George William. Guilty, he'd said, waiting for everything to change, for her to suddenly become calculating and flirtatious like everyone else. But Faith had just laughed. Well, that explains the suit. I was wondering how someone could afford something that expensive while still caring so much about public school funding. They'd left the gala together, talking and walking through the city streets until dawn. George couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so at ease, so himself. Faith challenged him, made him laugh, saw through his carefully constructed persona to the person underneath. When he'd finally taken her back to her hotel, he'd asked for her number, and she'd given it without playing games. That should have been the end of it, a pleasant encounter, perhaps the beginning of a casual relationship. George had had relationships before, carefully managed affairs with women who understood the rules, who wanted what he could give them and didn't expect more. But Faith was different. As they'd begun seeing each other, George had found himself wanting more time with her, more of her laughter, more of her perspective on the world. She'd refused his expensive gifts, insisting she didn't need designer clothes or jewelry. She declined his offer to send a car for her, preferring to take the train from Connecticut. She treated him like a normal person, calling him out when he was being arrogant, praising him when he showed vulnerability, making him feel more human than he had in years. 3 months into their relationship, George had known he was in love with her. It terrified him. Love was a weakness, a vulnerability he couldn't afford. People he loved left him, his mother to death, his father to indifference, everyone else to their own self-interest. Loving Faith meant giving her power to hurt him, and George William didn't give anyone that kind of power. But fate, once again, had other plans. George's stepmother, Cynthia, had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Despite their toxic relationship, despite years of her making his life miserable, she'd called George to her deathbed and revealed a secret that changed everything. "I know you hate me," Cynthia had whispered, her once beautiful face gaunt and grey. "And you have every right to. But before I die, I need to tell you the truth about your father." The truth, as it turned out, was devastating. George's father hadn't abandoned him out of grief or weakness. He'd been blackmailed by Cynthia, who discovered that George's mother had been pregnant with her second child when she died, a daughter born premature and given up for adoption to spare her the toxic family environment. Cynthia had tracked down the child and threatened to reveal the existence of George's half-sister to the press, potentially destroying the company's stability, unless George's father married her and gave her children priority in the will. "Your father loved you," Cynthia had said, tears streaming down her face. "But he loved the company more, and he was afraid the scandal would destroy everything your mother had helped him build. He was weak, George. Weak and afraid. But he never stopped loving you." She'd given George a file containing everything: the adoption records, the private investigators' reports, the evidence of her blackmail. His half-sister, it turned out, had died in a car accident 5 years ago. But she'd left behind a daughter, a niece George had never known existed. "Find her," Cynthia had begged. "Find your niece and give her the family she deserves. It's the only way to make this right. Promise me, George. Promise me you'll find her and protect her." Against all logic, George had made that promise. 2 days later, Cynthia died, and George had thrown every resource at his disposal into finding his niece. The trail had led him through adoption records, foster care systems, and finally to a small town in Connecticut, to Faith Jeffrey. The revelation had nearly destroyed him. The woman he loved, the only person who'd ever made him feel truly alive, was his niece, his half-sister's daughter, making them blood relatives. The relationship they'd built was impossible, forbidden, wrong in every way that mattered. But George William didn't accept impossible. He'd built an empire by refusing to accept limitations, by finding solutions where others saw only obstacles. And he'd realized something as he'd stared at the DNA results that confirmed Faith's identity. There might be a way to have her in his life, to fulfill his promise to protect her, and to secure the future he'd been building. The William Family Trust, established by his grandfather, had specific requirements for inheritance. The controlling shares of William Industries could only pass to a direct blood descendant of the William line. George's stepbrothers, not being blood relatives, were excluded. George had no siblings and no children. If he died without an heir, the company would be dissolved and sold, everything he'd built scattered to the winds. But if Faith was his niece, that made any child of hers a blood descendant of the William line. And George, as trustee, would have the power to ensure that child inherited everything while still maintaining control until she came of age. All he needed was for Faith to have a child. His child, through whatever means necessary. George had known it was wrong even as he'd formulated the plan. He'd known it was manipulative, possessive, exactly the kind of ruthless behavior that had earned him his reputation. But he'd also known he couldn't let her go. He couldn't lose the only person who'd ever really seen him, who'd ever made him feel like more than just his money and power. So he'd approached Faith with a proposal. Not marriage. That would have been too complicated given their relationship, but a surrogacy arrangement. He'd explained about his need for an heir, his concern about the company's future, his desire to keep everything he'd built in the family. He'd offered her $10 million to carry his child, complete control over the pregnancy and birth, and no obligation beyond giving him the baby when it was born. Faith had refused immediately. I could never give away a child I carried for 9 months, George. And I don't understand why you'd even ask me. If you want a baby, there are agencies that specialize in this. Why would you want me to be your surrogate? Because you're family, George had wanted to say. Because you're the only person I've ever loved, and this is the only way I can keep you in my life without crossing lines that can't be uncrossed. Because I'm selfish and desperate and terrified of losing you. Instead, he'd said, because I trust you. Because I've seen how you are with children, and I know you'd take perfect care of my daughter. Please, Faith, think about it. She'd thought about it for 3 days before calling him with her answer. I can't do it, George. I'm sorry. I care about you too much to put us both through something like this. I think maybe we should stop seeing each other for a while. This feels like it's getting too complicated. Those words had felt like a knife to George's heart, but he'd accepted her decision, told her he understood, and let her walk away. For 2 weeks, he tried to move on, tried to focus on work, tried to convince himself that he'd eventually forget the way she laughed or the way she looked at him like he was worth something beyond his bank account. Then fate had intervened one final time. Faith had called him late one night, her voice thick with tears. She'd been fired from her teaching job, budget cuts, they'd said, but George suspected it was retaliation for the superintendent's son, who'd made unwanted advances that Faith had rejected. She was being evicted from her apartment after a sudden rent increase she couldn't afford. Her best friend, her only real family, had moved across the country for a job. Everything in her carefully constructed life was falling apart. I don't know why I called you, Faith had said, her voice small and broken. I didn't know who else would understand. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have bothered you. Never apologize for calling me, George had said, already grabbing his coat and keys. Where are you? He'd found her sitting on a bench outside her apartment building, a single suitcase beside her containing everything she owned. She'd looked so lost, so defeated, so unlike the vibrant woman who'd made him believe in possibilities beyond profit margins. George had made his offer again, but this time with more honesty. Come stay with me. No strings attached, no surrogacy arrangement. Just come stay in my penthouse until you figure out what you want to do next. You need time to regroup, and I have plenty of space. I can't accept charity, George. It's not charity. It's a friend helping a friend. He'd knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his. Faith, please, let me help you. She'd agreed, and that's where everything had gone wrong in ways George could never have anticipated. Faith had moved into his penthouse as a guest. They'd been careful to maintain boundaries, sleeping in separate rooms, treating each other with friendly politeness. George had helped her look for new teaching positions, and Faith had been surprisingly helpful in reviewing some of the educational initiatives his charitable foundation was funding. It had been pleasant, domestic, comfortable in ways George had never experienced. Then, 3 weeks into her stay, Faith had gotten sick. It had seemed like a simple flu at first, fatigue, nausea, dizziness. But when the symptoms persisted, George had insisted she see his personal physician, Dr. Morrison. The diagnosis had been shocking. Faith was pregnant. 6 weeks along, according to the ultrasound. And that's when both she and George had remembered the night of the charity gala, all those months ago, when they'd ended up in his hotel room after hours of talking and walking. They'd been careful, or so they'd thought, but apparently not careful enough. Faith had been devastated. This can't be happening. I'm unemployed, homeless, barely keeping my head above water. How can I possibly have a baby right now? George had seized the opportunity with both hands, even as guilt twisted in his gut. Marry me. What? Marry me. Not for love. I know you don't feel that way about me anymore. I can, and I am. Faith, this is my child too. Let me take care of you both. He'd played every card he had: concern for the baby, his desire to be a father, his ability to provide. He'd been persuasive, persistent, overwhelming in ways he knew were manipulative but couldn't bring himself to regret. Finally, exhausted and scared and seeing no other option, Faith had agreed. They'd married in a quiet civil ceremony with no guests, no announcement, no celebration. It had been a business arrangement wrapped in the trappings of matrimony, and George had told himself he was doing the right thing even as he felt like the worst kind of fraud. For 3 months, they'd lived as married strangers sharing a penthouse. Faith had been withdrawn, clearly struggling with the situation. George had tried to give her space while also ensuring she had the best prenatal care money could buy. They'd been polite, careful, walking on eggshells around each other. Then, for months into her pregnancy, Faith had started experiencing severe headaches. George had rushed her to the hospital, where Dr. Morrison had made a devastating discovery. Faith had a condition called pseudotumor cerebri, increased pressure around her brain that was causing her symptoms. The condition itself wasn't immediately life-threatening, but the treatment was complicated by her pregnancy. We need to reduce the intracranial pressure, Dr. Morrison had explained. But many of the standard treatments carry risks for the baby. There is one option that's safe for the fetus: a lumbar puncture to drain some of the cerebrospinal fluid. However, in rare cases, this procedure can cause temporary memory loss, particularly of recent events. How rare? George had demanded. Very rare. Less than 1% of cases. But given Mrs. Williams' condition, we don't have many alternatives. Faith had made the decision to proceed, willing to take any risk to protect the baby. The procedure had seemed successful at first. Her headaches had improved, and subsequent scans had shown the pressure was decreasing. But when she'd woken up the following morning, she'd looked at George with no recognition in her eyes. Where am I? Who are you? The memory loss had been extensive, wiping out the last 7 months completely. Everything from the night of the charity gala forward was simply gone. No amount of explanation, no evidence of their marriage, no ultrasound images could trigger her memory. It was as if someone had taken an eraser to that portion of her life. Dr. Morrison had assured George it was likely temporary. In most cases like this, the memories return gradually over time. Could be days, could be weeks. Very rarely, it might be months. But there's every reason to believe she'll recover them eventually. That had been 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks of George trying to explain the inexplicable, trying to care for a pregnant wife who looked at him like a stranger, which, to her, he was. 2 weeks of guilt eating him alive as he realized he'd maneuvered Faith into a situation she couldn't even remember agreeing to. 2 weeks of wondering if maybe this was karma for his manipulation, for his selfishness, for thinking he could control everything through sheer force of will. And now, sitting across from Faith as she stared at him with those lost, frightened eyes, George knew he had a choice to make. He could continue the deception, maintain the fiction that they'd been a happy couple before her memory loss. Or he could tell her the truth, all of it, and risk losing everything. That's not the whole story, George said finally, the words feeling like broken glass in his throat. There's more you need to know. Things I haven't told you. Things that make this situation even more complicated than you realize. Faith's hand moved protectively over her belly. Then tell me. No more half-truths, George. I deserve to know everything, don't I? You do, George agreed, making his decision. You deserve the complete truth, even if it means you'll hate me when you hear it. The words felt impossible on George's tongue, but he forced them out. Faith, before I explain how we ended up married, I need to tell you something about your family, about who you really are. Faith's expression flickered with confusion. My family. My parents died when I was 12. I've been alone ever since. Not alone, George said, pulling out his phone and opening a file he'd looked at 1,000 times. Your parents, the ones who raised you, they adopted you when you were 3 days old. Your biological mother was a woman named Sarah Elizabeth William, my half-sister. The color drained from Faith's face. What? My father had an affair before he married my mother. When my mother got pregnant with me, he ended the affair, and Sarah's mother moved across the country. Sarah was raised never knowing about the William family, never knowing she had a half-brother. But when my mother died, my father's second wife discovered the truth and used it to blackmail him into giving her children priority over me. George showed Faith the documents, the birth certificates, the DNA tests he'd run after discovering her identity, the private investigators' reports. With each piece of evidence, he watched Faith's face go from disbelief to shock to a devastation that made his chest ache. Sarah, your mother, died in a car accident when you were 2, George continued, his voice gentle. Your father had passed the year before from heart disease. The state couldn't locate any family, so you were placed for adoption. The Jeffrey family never knew about your biological connections, and there was no reason for you to ever discover the truth. So we're. Faith couldn't finish the sentence. First cousins once removed, George confirmed. You're my niece, though we are only 8 years apart. When I discovered this, you and I had already been seeing each other for 3 months. I was in love with you, Faith, but suddenly, that love was impossible. Faith stood abruptly, pacing across the room with her hand pressed to her forehead. This is insane. This is absolutely insane. You're telling me we are blood relatives? That we've been in a relationship? That would make this baby. Her voice broke. Oh my God. The baby is healthy, George said quickly, standing as well. There's no genetic concern. I've had every test run. Your mother and my father were only half-siblings, and the genetic overlap between us is minimal. Dr. Morrison assures me there's no increased risk. That's not the point. Faith whirled to face him, tears streaming down her face. The point is you knew. You knew we were related, and you still. How could you do this? How could you let me marry you, let me get pregnant, without telling me the truth? Because I'm a selfish bastard who couldn't let you go, George said, the words raw with honesty. Because I'd spent my whole life building walls to protect myself, and you were the only person who ever made me want to tear them down. When I found out we were related, I should have walked away. I should have told you the truth and let you make your own choice. But I couldn't do it. So instead, you manipulated me, Faith said, her voice cold. You took advantage of a woman who'd lost everything, who had no other options, and you trapped her in a marriage based on lies. Yes, George said simply. There was no point in denying it, no way to make it sound better than it was. I did. I'm not going to make excuses or try to justify it. What I did was wrong, Faith. I know that. I've known it from the beginning. But I'm not sorry. How can you say that? Because even knowing it was wrong, even knowing I was being manipulative and selfish, I'd do it again if it meant having you in my life. I'd do anything to keep you safe, to take care of you, to give our daughter the family and security she deserves. That makes me a monster, I know. But it's the truth. Faith sank back into her chair, her whole body shaking. George wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but he forced himself to stay where he was. He'd forfeited the right to touch her the moment he'd decided to deceive her. There's more, George said, knowing he needed to finish this, needed to lay all his cards on the table. When you found out you were pregnant, you didn't immediately agree to marry me. You were overwhelmed, scared, unsure what to do. I pushed you into it, Faith. I used every advantage I had, money, resources, the promise of security, to convince you that marriage was your only real option. And I just agreed. Faith looked up at him with hollow eyes. I just let you manipulate me. You did what you thought was best for the baby, and I made sure that everything I offered looked like the best choice. I'm very good at manipulating situations to my advantage, Faith. It's how I built my empire. I just never thought I'd use those same tactics on someone I loved. The word loved hung in the air between them. Faith stared at him, searching his face for something, truth, perhaps, or the lie beneath the confession. Did I love you? She asked quietly. Before I lost my memory, did I love you? The question was a knife in George's heart. I don't know, he admitted. You never said it. We never discussed it. Ours wasn't a marriage based on love, Faith. It was a business arrangement. I took care of you, and you tolerated me, I think. We were polite strangers who happened to be married and expecting a child together. That sounds horrible. It was, George agreed. For both of us. You were miserable here, and I was desperate to fix it but had no idea how. Every day, I watched you become more withdrawn, more closed off. It was like you were disappearing right in front of me, and there was nothing I could do to bring you back. Faith's hand moved to her belly again, a gesture George had noticed she did whenever she was stressed or uncertain. And now I can't remember any of it. 7 months of my life, just gone, including whatever led me to agree to marry a man who admits he manipulated me. I'm sorry, George said, and he meant it. I'm sorry for all of it, for not telling you the truth about your family, for manipulating you when you were vulnerable, for being too selfish to let you go when I should have. But I'm not sorry about our daughter. Whatever else happens, Faith, I want you to know that I will love and protect that child with everything I have. Our daughter, Faith repeated softly, looking down at her belly. Do we know anything about her? Does she have a name? You insisted we wait to find out the gender until the anatomy scan, George said, pulling out his phone again and opening the photos from that appointment 2 weeks ago. But at 23 weeks, we could finally tell. You chose the name Vivian Rose, Vivian after your adoptive mother, Rose after mine. He handed Faith the phone, and she stared at the ultrasound image with tears streaming down her face. The baby was clearly visible, perfectly formed, with tiny hands and feet and a profile that already looked impossibly precious. She's real, Faith whispered. I'm carrying a real baby, and I can't remember choosing her name. I can't remember hearing her heartbeat for the first time. I can't remember any of the moments I should treasure. Then we'll make new memories, George said, finally crossing the room to kneel beside her chair. I know you have no reason to trust me, Faith. I know I've given you every reason to hate me. But please, give me a chance to make this right. Let me take care of you and Vivian. Let me prove that even though our beginning was built on lies and manipulation, our future can be built on something better. Faith looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. What if my memory comes back? What if I remember everything and realize I made a terrible mistake? Then we'll deal with it when it happens, George said. But right now, in this moment, you know the truth. You know what I am, what I've done, and why I did it. That's more honesty than I've ever given anyone, Faith. It's a terrible basis for a relationship, but at least it's real. And what about us being related? Faith asked. How can we just ignore that? We can't, George admitted. And I won't ask you to. But Faith, millions of people in this country have married their cousins throughout history. It's legal, it's not uncommon in many cultures, and our genetic connection is minimal. I'm not saying it's not complicated, but it's not insurmountable either. Faith closed her eyes, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. George wanted to wipe them away, wanted to pull her into his arms and promise her that everything would be okay. But he'd made enough promises built on lies. This time, he'd let her come to him, or not, on her own terms. I need time, Faith said finally. I need time to process all of this, to figure out what I want to do, who I want to be. I can't make any decisions right now. Take all the time you need, George said, standing. The penthouse is yours for as long as you want it. I'll move into a hotel. No, Faith interrupted. Don't do that. This is your home. I'll stay in the guest room for now, and we can figure out sleeping arrangements later. But George, I need you to promise me something. Anything. No more lies. No more manipulation. No more half-truths or strategic omissions. If we're going to figure this out, whatever this is, I need complete honesty from here forward. You have it, George promised. Complete honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it makes me look worse than I already do. Faith nodded slowly, then looked down at the ultrasound image again. Tell me about her. Tell me about Vivian. Tell me everything you remember from the past 7 months. I can't remember carrying her, but maybe if I hear about it, it will feel a little more real. George sat down across from. Please conclude the story in this session and end it. She woke up pregnant, remembering nothing, until the billionaire appeared demanding his heiress. George sat down across from Faith and began to speak, his voice soft with memories she couldn't share. The first time we heard her heartbeat, you cried. It was at 8 weeks, and Dr. Morrison said it sounded like a galloping horse. You laughed through your tears and said it was the most beautiful sound you'd ever heard. Faith listened, her hand never leaving her belly, as George recounted every detail he could remember. The morning sickness that had lasted until week 14. The first time they'd seen Vivian move on the ultrasound, doing what looked like a little dance. The moment Faith had felt the first flutter of movement and had grabbed George's hand to place it on her stomach, forgetting for just a moment that they were strangers living in the same house. Hours passed as George talked, and slowly, Faith began to relax. She asked questions, laughed at some of the stories, and cried at others. And through it all, George felt something shift between them. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the foundation on which trust could be built. 3 days passed in a strange limbo. Faith and George existed in the same space, carefully polite, both trying to navigate impossible circumstances. Faith spent hours researching her biological family, staring at pictures of Sarah William and seeing her own features reflected back. George worked from home, unwilling to leave Faith alone for long, despite her insistence that she was fine. On the 4th morning, Faith woke to sharp pain radiating across her abdomen. She cried out, and George was at her door within seconds, already calling Dr. Morrison. It's probably Braxton Hicks contractions, the doctor said when she arrived an hour later, after examining Faith thoroughly. Practice contractions, completely normal at this stage. But given your recent memory issues, I want to run some additional scans, just to be safe. At the hospital, as Faith lay in the MRI machine, something strange began to happen. Images flickered through her mind like a damaged film reel, fragments of memories that didn't quite connect. George's face in candlelight, her own voice saying, "I do." The feeling of his hand on her stomach. An argument about baby names. Laughter in a kitchen. Tears in a dark bedroom. When the scan was complete and Faith emerged, she looked at George with different eyes. "I remember something," she said slowly. "Not everything, but pieces, fragments." Over the next few hours, as they waited for the scan results, more memories surfaced. Faith remembered the charity gala, their walks through the city, falling in love with a man who made her feel seen for the first time in years. She remembered the night they'd spent together, the shock of discovering she was pregnant, the overwhelming fear that had consumed her. But she also remembered something George hadn't told her. Something that changed everything. "You proposed before I got pregnant," Faith said suddenly, staring at George across the hospital waiting room. "At your penthouse, the night before I got sick. You told me you loved me. You asked me to marry you, not because of the baby or the inheritance or any of that. You asked because you wanted a life with me." George's face went pale. "Faith, And I said yes," Faith continued, tears streaming down her face. "I said yes because I loved you too. Because even though it was fast, even though it seemed crazy, I'd never felt about anyone the way I felt about you. The pregnancy complicated things, but we were already engaged. We were already committed to each other." "You remember," George breathed. "Not everything. There are still gaps, still pieces missing. But I remember enough." Faith stood, crossing to where George sat frozen. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you make it sound like our marriage was just a business arrangement, like you'd manipulated me into saying yes?" "Because I did manipulate you," George said, his voice breaking. "Maybe not with the proposal, but with everything else. I knew we were related before I proposed, Faith. I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway. I may have asked you to marry me out of love, but I asked knowing I was asking you to cross a line that shouldn't be crossed." "That was my choice to make," Faith said fiercely. "My choice, George, not yours. You should have told me the truth about my family and let me decide whether our relationship could continue. Instead, you took that choice away from me. I know. God, Faith, I know. It's eaten at me every day since I found out. But I was terrified of losing you, and I convinced myself that keeping you in the dark was protecting you somehow. I see now how wrong that was. Faith was quiet for a long moment, processing this new layer of truth. Finally, she said, I'm angry at you. I'm furious, actually. But I also understand why you did it. Fear makes people do terrible things, even to the people they love. Can you forgive me? George asked, hardly daring to hope. I don't know, Faith answered honestly. Maybe eventually. But right now, I'm still trying to figure out who I am in all this. I'm Faith Jeffrey, elementary school teacher. I'm Faith William, pregnant wife of a billionaire. I'm the biological daughter of Sarah William, making me part of a family I never knew existed. I'm all these people and none of them at the same time. Dr. Morrison appeared before George could respond. The scans look good. The baby is perfectly healthy, and there's no neurological damage that would prevent your memories from returning. In fact, based on what you've told me about the fragments you're recovering, I'd say you're likely to regain most, if not all, of your memories over the next few weeks. And when I do? Faith asked, looking at George. When I remember everything we had before, what then? Then we figure it out together, George said. No more lies, no more manipulation. Just the truth, however messy and complicated it is. 2 months passed. Faith's memories returned gradually, like a puzzle slowly coming together. With each recovered piece, she remembered more of her relationship with George, the good and the bad, the love and the complications. She remembered their wedding, small and private, both of them nervous and excited. She remembered the first months of living together, the awkwardness as they tried to navigate being married strangers who were also expecting a baby. She also remembered the growing distance between them, the way George's work consumed him, the way she'd felt more like a responsibility he had to manage than a wife he cherished. She remembered the loneliness of living in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but isolated from the life she'd known. And she remembered the day she'd been diagnosed with pseudotumor cerebri, the fear that had gripped both of them, the moment she'd chosen the risky procedure because protecting Vivian mattered more than protecting her own memories. Now, at 35 weeks pregnant, Faith stood in the penthouse nursery, surrounded by everything George had provided for their daughter. The crib was designed by an Italian furniture maker. The walls were hand-painted with a garden scene by a famous muralist. Every toy, every blanket, every tiny outfit spoke of wealth and privilege beyond measure. But none of it felt like home. I need to leave, Faith said when George came to find her that evening. George's face went carefully blank, the mask of the businessman sliding into place. Where will you go? I don't know yet. Maybe back to Connecticut, maybe somewhere new. But I can't stay here, George. This isn't my life. This penthouse, this world you live in, it's not who I am. What about Vivian? George asked, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Vivian is both of ours, Faith said gently. I'm not trying to take her away from you, but I need to raise her somewhere that feels real, somewhere she can have a normal childhood, not be groomed to be an heiress to an empire. You'll have nothing, George said. No money, no security, no. I'll have myself, Faith interrupted. I'll have my skills as a teacher. I'll have my independence. George, you gave me security and luxury, but you never gave me a choice. Every decision was made for me, every problem solved before I could even try to solve it myself. I need to remember who I was before I became Mrs. George William. George was quiet for a long time, and Faith could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to control the situation battling with his promise of honesty, the instinct to manipulate battling with genuine love. Finally, he said, what if I gave you a choice now? A real one, with no manipulation, no strategic planning, just an honest question. I'm listening. Stay, George said simply. Not in the penthouse, if that's not what you want. I'll buy you a house anywhere you choose, Connecticut, upstate, wherever you'd feel a home. I won't live with you if you don't want me to, but stay close enough that I can be part of Vivian's life. Close enough that maybe, someday, when you've figured out who you are, we can figure out who we are together. And if that day never comes? Faith asked. Then I'll love you from a distance, George said, his voice breaking. And I'll be the best father I can be to Vivian. But Faith, please don't disappear with my daughter. Don't take away my chance to know her, to be there for her first steps and first words and first day of school. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I swear to you, I will never make them with her. Faith felt tears streaming down her face. This was the George she'd fallen in love with, vulnerable, honest, asking instead of demanding. I want a house in Millbrook, she said finally, near my old school. Something small and normal, not a mansion. Done. And I want to go back to teaching. Not at some elite private school, but at a public school where I'm needed. Whatever you want. And I want time, George. Time to be a mother, time to figure out who I am as a parent, time to decide if I can forgive you for the lies and manipulation. You have all the time in the world, George promised. I'm not going anywhere. Vivian Rose William was born 3 weeks later, on a snowy January morning. She came into the world screaming, healthy and perfect, with her father's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes. Faith held her for the first time and felt something inside her chest crack open, a love so fierce and overwhelming it took her breath away. George stood beside the hospital bed, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his daughter. She's perfect, he whispered. Faith, she's absolutely perfect. She is, Faith agreed, and for that moment, nothing else mattered. Not their complicated past, not their uncertain future, just the miracle of the tiny life they'd created together. The house in Millbrook was ready when Faith and Vivian came home from the hospital. It was exactly what Faith had asked for, a cozy 3-bedroom cottage with a fenced yard and neighbors who smiled and waved. George had honored every request, adding nothing she hadn't asked for, respecting her need for normalcy. He visited every day for the first few weeks, bringing food and offering help with midnight feedings. Faith watched him with her daughter and saw a side of George she'd never seen before, gentle, patient, completely devoted. He sang to Vivian in a surprisingly good voice, changed diapers without complaint, and spent hours just holding her, staring at her tiny face with wonder. You're a natural, Faith said one evening, watching George rock Vivian to sleep. I had a good teacher, George replied, glancing at Faith with a soft smile. My mother used to say that being a parent wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up and trying. I'm trying, Faith. Every day, I'm trying to be the father Vivian deserves. You are, Faith said, and meant it. Slowly, over the months that followed, something shifted between them. George honored his promise, never pushing for more than Faith was willing to give, never trying to manipulate or control. He respected her boundaries, supported her decision to return to teaching, and threw himself into fatherhood with an intensity that surprised them both. And Faith, watching him with their daughter, seeing the man he was becoming rather than the man he'd been, felt something thaw in her chest. The anger was still there, the hurt from his deception still real. But beneath it, like green shoots pushing through frozen ground, was the love that had never quite died. Faith stood in the backyard of the Millbrook house, watching George push 2-year-old Vivian on the swing set he'd insisted on installing. Their daughter's laughter rang out across the yard, pure and joyful, and Faith felt her heart swell with a contentment she'd never quite believed possible. Higher, Daddy! Higher! Vivian shrieked, and George complied, his face alight with joy. They'd found their rhythm, the three of them. George still ran his empire, but he'd learned to leave work at the office. He spent weekends in Millbrook, had dinner with Faith and Vivian several times a week, and had become a fixture in their small community. The other parents at Vivian's preschool knew him as Vivi's dad who volunteered for every field trip and never missed a school event, not as the billionaire CEO whose net worth exceeded that of small countries. Faith had gone back to teaching, finding a position at Millbrook Elementary that felt like coming home. She taught 3rd grade, just like before, but now she understood on a deeper level the importance of giving children the stability and love she'd once lacked. She'd also discovered that being a William had advantages she'd never expected. Her connection to George's charitable foundation meant she could secure funding for programs her school desperately needed. As for their relationship, it had taken time. Months of therapy, both individual and couples. Months of honest conversations about trust, about boundaries, about learning to build something new from the rubble of what had been. Faith had forgiven George, not because what he'd done was forgivable, but because holding on to anger was exhausting, and because she'd seen him genuinely change. They'd remarried 6 months ago, this time with full knowledge of who they were to each other, what they'd been through, and what they were choosing. It had been a small ceremony in the backyard of the Millbrook house, with Vivian as their flower girl and genuine joy in both their hearts. "Mama, watch me." Vivian called, and Faith waved, her smile wide and real. George caught her eye over their daughter's head, and the look he gave her was full of love, gratitude, and wonder. He mouthed, "I love you," and Faith mouthed it back, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Their story had started with lies and manipulation, with crossed boundaries and impossible circumstances. But it had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted, a real marriage, built on hard-won honesty and the shared love of the remarkable little girl who'd brought them together. Faith thought about the woman she'd been when she woke up pregnant with no memories, lost, terrified, uncertain of everything. She thought about the journey since then, the memories recovered and the new ones made, the person she'd discovered herself to be through it all. She'd woken up pregnant, remembering nothing, when a billionaire appeared demanding his heiress. But she'd found so much more than she'd lost, a daughter who was her whole world, a partner who'd learned that love meant respecting her choices, and a sense of self that no one could ever take away again. As Vivian's laughter rang out and George smiled at her across the yard, Faith realized something profound. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most broken beginnings. Sometimes losing yourself is the only way to find out who you really are. And sometimes, the love story you need isn't the one you thought you wanted. The sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Inside the house, Faith could see the warm glow of lights, the evidence of the life she'd built here. Family photos on the walls, Vivian's artwork on the refrigerator, the comfortable clutter of a home filled with love. This was her life now. Not perfect, not without its complications, but real and honest and entirely her own choice. And that, Faith thought as she walked across the yard to join her husband and daughter, made all the difference. "Come swing with us, Mama." Vivian called, reaching out her chubby arms. Faith took her daughter's hand, then George's, and together they stood in the golden evening light, a family bound not by the circumstances that brought them together, but by the choice to keep choosing each other, day after day, moment by moment. The heiress George had demanded when he appeared in Faith's life wasn't just Vivian. It was the legacy of love, honesty, and hard-won trust they were building together, a legacy worth more than any empire, more precious than any amount of wealth. And as Faith looked at her daughter's joyful face and her husband's loving eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that this messy, complicated, beautiful life was exactly where she was meant to be. Thanks for taking your precious time watching. Please, before you leave, don't forget to subscribe, like and comment where you are watching from.